Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I'm the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. We are pleased that you're joining us for this program, which is focused on using the Thinker's Guide to Analytic Thinking in the Classroom from our Thinker's Guide series. We will be working today with three of our Thinker's Guides, primarily the Analytic Thinking Guide. Many of you have this guide, and if you don't, I'll be providing the visuals that we need from the guide to understand how to use the material in this guide to help our students learn at a deeper level as they're thinking through our content. We'll also refer briefly to the Thinker's Guide to Scientific Thinking, as well as our Student Guide to Historical Thinking. So if you have those available on your shelf, you may want to pull those now. Before we begin to focus on analytic thinking as our primary topic for this conversación with our fellows, I would like to first thank all of you for all of those who attended our international conference for joining us, and hope that many of you who were not able to attend will be able to join us next summer. We had a magnificent time. We learned, we went to deeper levels of understanding, we practiced thinking at higher levels, we questioned one another, we pressed one another, and this is one of the common occurrences at our conferences. So we hope that you'll join us for not only our conference, but other events we'll be planning for you in this upcoming, the end of this year and into next year. It's not too late to register for either of our two fall online courses, which begin very soon on August the 25th. As you see, we have a course for instructors, how to infuse critical thinking into instruction, and we have a course for anyone interested in learning critical thinking for everyday life and in one's learning. We also invite you to contact us and discuss with us your plans for professional development and how we can help support those plans. Whether you are in K-12, higher education, in government, business, wherever you are in human societies, we can help work with you in bringing critical thinking to your institutions so that we can together advance fair-minded critical societies. We're focused today on what we term in our approach the elements of reasoning. We can use other terms. We can call these parts of thinking, structures of thought. What's most important is that we come to understand human reasoning in such a way as to be able to enter it, to figure out what we're really doing when we reason, and how to improve our reasoning when there are problems in our reasoning. We'll be focusing on the analysis of thought, but we want to connect the analysis of thought from the beginning with the evaluation of thought, so that we will deal with the analysis and evaluation simultaneously to some degree. We can think of critical thinking in terms of these three dimensions, and remember, there are many ways to articulate a reasonable conception of critical thinking, but this is a helpful way. Critical thinking can be understood to entail the analysis of thinking by focusing on the parts, which is what we're focusing on today, and how to bring these ideas into the classroom. And we can also, in connection with that, consider the evaluation of thinking by focusing on universal intellectual standards. So we analyze thinking by focusing on the parts, taking it apart. Then we need to evaluate those parts using intellectual standards. Why? Because ultimately We want to be able to improve our thinking. Why? Because the quality of our lives depend upon the quality of our thinking. Let's burrow into the concept of the elements of reasoning from different perspectives, beginning with this one. Whenever we think or whenever we reason, we think for a purpose, within a point of view, based on assumptions, leading to implications and consequences. We use data, facts, and experiences to make inferences and judgments based on concepts and theories in attempting to answer a question. This, to me, is a very powerful, or entails a very powerful set of understandings. And if we understand that whenever we're reasoning, however well or poorly, these parts are present, then we can enter our thinking at any one of these parts, and we can ask, what is my purpose right now? What is the question at issue in this meeting at this moment? What information am I using right now in my reasoning to determine whether to make this or that decision? What facts am I using? What experiences? How do I see those experiences in my mind? How do they present themselves? We can go further in any one of these. We can delve deeper into any one of these elements. But these parts are present whenever we're reasoning. As we go through our day, we're routinely reasoning through these structures. We usually are not aware of this, but they're there. We make inferences. We're continually making inferences as we go through our daily experience, our set of experiences. We begin with ideas or theories, concepts from which we see the world. This is rather abstract at the minute, but I'm going to come to some examples so we'll get a feel for this at deeper and deeper levels as we move through these elements. We begin with certain ideas that we take for granted. Our thinking goes somewhere. It has implications, whether we see them or not. And we come from some point of view, some frame of reference. Now, one of the things I would like you to see here in these elements is how this is not a list of 8 ideas. Rather, it is to be understood as a dynamic, interactive set of concepts. So that where you have one, you have the other 7. And so you can target any one of them, but understand that when you do, the others are there as well, but you're not targeting them at the moment. That's fine. You can say, what am I assuming right now about this relationship? What am I assuming about my spouse? What am I assuming about my peers, my colleagues at the office? What assumptions do I make about them and their thinking? So we can enter at any point. We can focus on assumptions, but when we do, in this case, we would also need to think about potentially the other elements of reasoning and how they're affecting our assumptions. What information do I have about this colleague? What information do I bring to the table? What information do I read in about the colleague that's not actually there? So let's say that if I write a paper and I think it's rather grand, and I offer it to my colleague for feedback, who's a very good thinker, and my colleague takes a red mark and marks it up in numerous ways with good suggestions. And in the beginning, let's say I was assuming that my colleague would think it was as grand and without errors as I did, but lo and behold, he doesn't agree. And I was using information and coming to that in forming that assumption, information about him, about others, about myself. And as it turns out, I wasn't taking into account some other information that was relevant, because as it turns out, this colleague gave me good feedback, which I may or may not want to hear based on my point of view and how narrow-minded I am at the moment. So one of the things I want you to see here is the dynamic interplay between the elements, and to understand these processes occurring, influencing one another, and understanding that within every element you see there are, as it were, other words or other, let's say, similar words within the elements pie here. So we've got to do something with those. Under information, data, observations, facts, and experiences are all slightly different. Now, we could give them each their own piece of pie here if we wanted to, conceptually. But to me, one of the beauties in these elements is that they're simple while also maintaining some of the real complexities embedded in them, and entailing the complexities that we need to understand in order to intervene in thinking at the deepest levels. So we can enter at concepts. I can say, what is my concept of teaching? My concept of education. What is my concept of education? What's my idea? What idea comes into my mind when I think of education? Then I can ask myself, well, what theories have formed my concept of education, my larger concept? What theories have I read that I've internalized that have given rise to my conceptualization of education? So you begin to see the complexities here. What we want to see with the elements of reasoning is both its complexities and its simplicity or simplicities. We're working from the Analytic Thinking Guide, and I'm going to refer to a few of the pages here, beginning with page 5, or really 4 and 5. I want to make a few more general comments about reasoning and its importance in human life. And we'll be thinking about how we will use these ideas in teaching students the analysis of thought, the elements of reasoning, and how to bring these ideas into their learning and into their lives. What I like to do is have students begin by teaching, in essence, pages 4 and 5, and then 6 and 7 to each other in pairs. I might do this as well in a workshop. I have person A take pages 4 and 5, person B 6 and 7. Have the student A reads page 4 and 5, and then is studying in order to teach this content to her peer who is studying pages 6 and 7. And then I will give them a few minutes afterwards to teach to one another their content. And in doing so, I will understand that their teaching will be imperfect, that they will only be able to teach what they have themselves learned. They will only be able to learn a small amount in a short amount of time, and they will likely be, to some degree, misteaching these ideas. Just as when we learn to play tennis, we are going to miss hitting the ball across the net many times. In fact, we'll continue to do that as tennis players, no matter how good we are. So we're going to have errors in the learning and teaching process. We want to be comfortable with that. So what I want my students to do is begin to teach these ideas to themselves, these and any other ideas that they can teach to themselves rather than me teaching it to them. And when they are teaching these ideas, this content in this format, I will not allow them to use their books when they're teaching, only when they're studying, but they can use their notes. So I'm encouraging students to write their ideas, because it is through writing and discussing and reading and listening and rewriting and rethinking that we learn ideas and bring them into our thinking. So this would be a starting place for an instructional strategy in terms of helping students begin to understand the analysis of thinking and its importance in human thought and to human development. On page 4, what we are hoping to help the reader understand, among other things, is that reasoning is so central to human life and human thought that it's almost difficult to even understand or conceptualize what it in fact is. It's so much like the air we breathe that we don't notice it. It's always within us and around us. Our reasoning informs almost all of our behavior to some degree, and we have to reason through the everyday problems of our lives, whether we like it or not. And we have to take into account the reasoning of all of those around us who are influencing us in any way that is significant. And if we want to be um, citizens who can contribute at a high level in human societies, then we must understand the reasoning of our politicians, the reasoning of those in government, the reasoning of those in business who influence us. We have reasoning is all around us and within us. And most everything that we experience in the world has some connection with human reasoning. And by that, I don't mean that human reasoning is everything and all that humans do, because we have emotions, we have sensations, and this is not reasoning, but these are not reasoning, but these are informed by reasoning and influenced by reasoning. And so there's a sense in which we can't escape our reasoning, and yet we allow it, and it controls us. Our reasoning controls us, but the question is, do we control our reasoning? The, we are reasoning through these parts of our reasoning that we see on page 5. These are happening in our thinking at all times when we're reasoning. These elements of thought are there. They're occurring in the mind. We have a point of view. We begin with assumptions, etc. We can't escape these elements of reasoning in our thinking. And if we understand this, then we begin to see reasoning everywhere in human life. And we begin to see the problems that emerge when we aren't commanding our reasoning. So how many of us have full command of the purposes that we generate, the questions that we're raising in all the significant domains of our lives, the information that we use to reason through the big problems that we face? How many of us are in command of the concepts that guide our marriages, our teaching, our professional life more generally, the concepts that guide us as we move through this amazing process called human life? How many of us command the inferences that we're making at any given moment in every given situation? Because we're making these inferences, we're coming to conclusions, we're deciding things. Are we commanding our inferences? To what extent are any of us commanding our assumptions, our assumption base? What do you assume about women, about men, about attractive women, attractive men, about people who are of a different color, from a different country, that are shorter, that are taller? What do we assume about people for, as it were, no good reason? Sometimes our assumptions are good assumptions. But if they're functioning at the unconscious level, then how will we know that they're good assumptions? How will we enter our assumption base and make sure that our assumptions are sound before we act on those assumptions? Am I acting out of bias and prejudice, or is this good reasoning? It always appears good to the mind at the moment. That's because of something called self-deception that we are all naturally skilled at. Now I'm bringing in some other dimensions to show the complexities in this as we focus on hopefully some of the simplicities in the elements of thought. How many of us are in command of the implications or understand the implications of our thinking? If I make this decision, what is likely to happen after that? And after that, and then after that, and then after that? How many of us go that far? If I marry this person, what will happen after that? And what will happen after that? And what might happen after this? And what could happen after that? If I design instruction in the following ways, what are the implications? What logically follows from this set of new ideas? What will happen when I move into the classroom? What might happen? And what after that? And what after that? Following out the implications. How many of us are in command of the point of view that we bring to any given situation? When you're in an argument with your spouse, what is your point of view? What is her point of view? Which of your points of view, which of you has the most reasonable point of view? Or are you both equally unreasonable or reasonable, whichever you choose? So what we see here again is the dynamic interplay between the elements, the fact that they're interactive, one depends on the other. We see that these, adding to our theory, these elements always occur in context, in a given context. So when you're dealing with a questioned issue, you always want to ask, what's the actual human given context? Or what's the context that involves other sentient creatures as well? Now let us move forward and focus on a few of the other pages in this guide. I've suggested how we might begin to introduce this work to students by having them first read and teach to each other these first few pages. And I want them to focus on page 7 in the following way. I want them to see that if this top part is true, if these elements of reasoning are always embedded in reasoning throughout our daily life, as we go through our daily existence and deal with the problems that we deal with every day, if these parts are present, then by implication, there are many questions we can ask based on these elements. I can ask any one of these fundamental 8 questions. What is my purpose right now? What's my fundamental purpose? What's my primary purpose? What is my point of view with respect to this issue right now? What assumptions am I using in my reasoning at this moment, in this context, in this meeting, with regard to this other human being, or whatever the case may be? What are the implications of my reasoning, the important implications? What information do I need to answer my question? What information am I using right now in my reasoning? What are the most fundamental inferences or conclusions I can come to in this situation? What is the most basic concept embedded in the question? And what is the key question I'm trying to answer? Note that these elements of reasoning can be placed in any form. In other words, we can have purpose here, and we can have purpose here, and we can have question here, and we can have question here. We want to think of the elements of reasoning not as a list of 1 through 8, but again, dynamic interactive process. So that I can say, wait a minute, what's happening right now? There's a problem with what in my thinking? There's a problem with my purpose. That's it. problem with my purpose, or no, there's a problem with the question at issue. I don't have enough information in my question. That's where the real problem is. So I want to focus on the question. So I'm not going around and looking at, let's see, it's number 2 in the circle. Well, what's number 2? That's question. That's what we may need to do in the beginning. In fact, we probably do need to do that in the beginning. But ultimately, we've got it. We want to think of, or in my mind, I think of this circle in my mind, and I can enter at any point, so that it's, again, not a list, but it's a dynamic, interactive process. Let me point out one other thing about this the questions that we can ask when we understand the elements. Not only can I ask questions about my own reasoning, but I can ask questions about anyone's reasoning. So I can say, what is your fundamental purpose right now? If you're my instructor, what is your fundamental purpose right now? What is the key question at the heart of this assignment right now? If I'm your student, what assumptions are you making about me, the student, right now? I might be brave in asking you that question, but I could still ask you. I could say, what are some implications, important implications of my learning in your classroom right now? And what information do I need within this field that you, the teacher, are going to be hopefully giving me? This is thinking from a student perspective, that I can use later. And maybe the student is asking, what information do I need to figure out how to get through this course by doing the least amount of work? If that's the question that the student is asking, and that's the information the student is looking for, then we have a problem to begin with. But I would like to at least know that that's the question the student is asking. So I am using these elements of reasoning all day long, whether I know it or not, and so is everyone else in the room and in the world. And if I know this, then I can question my purpose, your purpose, his question, their purpose, his concepts, their inferences, and there's no end to what we can question just using these elements of reasoning. In order to enter thinking at a deeper level than we can without the elements of thought, and to plumb our thinking and to find problems in our thinking, and again, to correct those problems. So first we need to understand the role of reasoning in human life in order to understand the importance of these elements to, in my view, all humans living a human life. In other words, I believe we all need these tools in order to reason through the incredible complexities that we now face as humans living a human life in this increasingly complex world. Now, in the Analytic Thinking Guide, I want you to notice that every page in this guide focuses on the elements of reasoning except for these 2 pages, pages 8 and 9, and they also focus on the elements, but primarily through the intellectual standards. And I want to mention a few things about these pages before proceeding to the analysis of thought. We take our thinking apart, we figure out our purpose, question, information, inferences, etc. And when we do that, we also need to, as a part and parcel of that process, to assess the parts. So am I clear about my purpose? Is my information accurate? Is my information relevant? Am I thinking broadly about the question where there's more than one point of view? Am I treating a complex question as if it were simple? Am I thinking through the logical complexities or the logical connections here? Am I thinking through the logic of the situation? Is my question logical in context? Am I thinking through the logical implications? Are my purposes significant? Am I getting derailed from the significant purposes in life. Think about how many people spend their lives in the trivial. They never get beyond that. Their daily life is focused on chatting and trivial thought, and they go home and they watch TV, and they watch these typical TV shows that, as it were, bring their thinking down. Um, if you will, dumb our thinking down. This is part of what happens as we are going through life. Our thinking is we become less developed, more than rather than more developed, when we focus on the trivial over and over and over again, rather than the important things that we should be focusing on, the big ideas, the powerful ideas that can significantly improve our experiences as we move through life. What kind of music do we listen to? Where does that bring us? At what level does that bring us to in our thinking? Do we when we are engaging with other people in dialogue, are we focusing on significant topics, important ideas, or are we gossiping? What are we doing in our daily discussions? In the classroom, are we focusing on the significant concepts when we know we can only deal with a handful? What are those powerful ideas that you, the faculty member, will teach me, the student, that I will need through life, that will transform me as a human being, that will transform my character? What are those significant ideas? Or what are those powerful scientific ideas that I need to know as a thinker living this life that requires scientific thinking or ethical reasoning, or whatever the powerful ideas that you, the faculty member, have to offer me, the student, as I try to learn those ideas and think them into my thinking? And to what extent is our thinking fair? Are we adhering to the standard of fairness? These are only a few what we consider essential intellectual standards among a much larger set. But immediately as we move forward with the analytic thinking guide, we see the importance of spending some time with these standards so we can bring them into our use of the elements of reasoning. Now, I'm moving around a bit. I could focus on any one set of pages and focus on instructional design with these, but I tend to have my favorites, so I'll move forward to those. What we want to those first, what we want to do in part is to understand where we are, what we are reaching for. So what we want, among other things, is for our students to be able to, in essence, engage in these processes routinely in the privacy of their own minds as they're moving through life and through their work in the classroom. I want my students to understand that all reasoning has a purpose. We've already said that. So let's take that a step further. My students, to take this idea seriously, could do these things. Take time to state your purpose clearly. So let's try this. My student says to me, I think I want to get married, and I want to marry this woman. So I say, okay, what is your purpose in getting married? Take time to state your purpose clearly. See how fundamental that is? But how we often miss the fundamentals. And I might say, here's what you could do. Take these pages and work with your fiance or this person you're considering marrying, and engage in this kind of dialogue. Tell your soon-to-be spouse, I'm going to first take time to state my purpose clearly in getting married. It seems rather like, let's see, sterile or something like that. But actually, it's the opposite, because what it does is it gives us a way to, a concrete way to unpack our purposes, to really get command of our purposes. They're in fact guiding our thinking. So if we're getting married, I would like to know what your purpose is. And I would like to know that loudly and clearly. um, and I'm also going to not only hear what you say to me, but I'm also going to observe your behavior, because though you may be stating what you think is your purpose clearly, your behavior may imply that your purpose is actually something very different from this purpose that you stated clearly. So though you stated it clearly, it may not be accurate. So you see, I'm only on the first point, and there is, again, much complexity here. I could ask students to distinguish your purpose from related purposes. So what is just to go further with our examples, so what is the purpose of marriage? How is that different from the purpose of just living together or just having a romantic relationship? How are those purposes different? And which is better and under what circumstances? Would one be better than the other? Check periodically to be sure you're still on target. So how many people 5 years after they're married, for instance, checking periodically, you could do this every 5 years, you could restate your purpose. My purpose then was, and I stated this purpose to you 5 years ago, and I'm saying that that's still my purpose, and I'm wondering if you have seen that that was my purpose, or whether my behavior did not imply that that was my purpose. So you see, when we take these elements and standards seriously, we see another level of living that's available to us. But this is much more difficult and requires these basic steps that seem to sort of go against something like, let's say, romance. We want it to just sort of feel good, but we need to think critically about all the important domains of our lives, including this domain where many people tend to run into difficulties. Now, I could go through these other elements in the following in a similar way, but I won't do that. You can begin to see how we could use these with our students. Have them do something like what I just did in the classroom. Take purpose and give your own example in the way that I did, something like that, and then have them work in pairs or groups of 3 and take number 2. Read it aloud. Um, Ask themselves to think of an example in which they can think of an important question at issue that they need to think through, and practice stating it clearly and precisely, thinking of an example they can share. You could give them a question and ask them to state it more clearly or more precisely to gain more clarity. There are many moves that we can make here, but one powerful fundamental idea underlying any of these moves we may make is to understand that the students need to do this thinking themselves and work with these words using their own words. So though they won't be able to make the moves at the high level that we can, or that we will be able to eventually, they can do a lot of good thinking when they have good content to begin with and direction for their thinking. So let's let them work with the ideas, play with the ideas, enjoy the ideas, bring their own examples to the ideas. That is how we will breathe life into our work with students, among other ways. We can have students teach these pages to each other. We're introducing the elements of reasoning here. Again, working in pairs, but changing our groupings routinely. We can have students work in groups of 3, groups of 2, silently studying for a few minutes and then doing a little bit of teaching on focusing on these 8 pages. This page 22 is a very good visual diagram that brings together the elements and the standards and captures visually what is happening as we go through life every day if we were to understand it. So the figuring mind has some object out there. That's the world that we are trying to understand, meaning when I say the world, I mean any part of the world that we experience or choose to experience. And this object has a logic or is part of a logic that we need to figure out. And to do that, we must use our minds and we must use the reasoning that is implicit in in the workings of the human mind. In other words, all of us, again, naturally reason. We begin to reason from very, very early in life. We're reasoning, I'll say, almost all day long. Even when we think we're not reasoning, we're still reasoning. For instance, if you are at the end of the day, you're watching TV or you're surfing the net, you're reasoning. The entire time you're doing that, it may feel like you're relaxing and that you're not really thinking because you're not thinking critically, maybe, maybe you are, but you are reasoning nonetheless. And to me, understanding this is very powerful because if I understand this and as I'm watching, let's say an old movie, I'm relaxing, a classic, at the end of the day, I'm understanding as I'm watching this that I'm still reasoning. I'm taking those ideas into my mind to some extent actively. And I'm probably also thinking about problems that I dealt with that day, maybe problems I'm going to be dealing with tomorrow. Reasoning, reasoning, reasoning. The mind is continually reasoning. We can tell the mind, relax. Now you need to relax. I have to reason to tell myself to relax. And I may stop relaxing at any given moment because I'm thinking of a problem. That's because I'm starting to reason, and I need to reason myself out of that if I need to relax. So there's no way to avoid human reasoning. And so because we're continually reasoning, it makes sense for us to employ intellectual standards in determining what reasoning to accept, what reasoning to reject in our own thinking and in the thinking of others. So we can use the term the logic of now to move forward. We can figure out using the elements of reasoning the logic of anything having to do with reasoning. I can take the logic of love, a concept, a deep concept. This, by the way, when we're dealing with the logic of a powerful concept, there's not going to be one right answer that we're looking for, but we want students to reach the bullseye that a reasonable person would consider. In other words, a reasonable person would articulate the logic of love in a certain way, adhering to certain tenets, in the way that Erich Fromm would articulate the logic of love in a deep way. And somebody would say, well, that's not my concept of love. I don't have that deep concept of love. Then I would say, well, then maybe you need to think of your concept of love because it's a deep concept by implication. That is, deep thinkers have thought deeply about it and do think deeply about it in daily life because it's too important not to think deeply about if you're engaging in it. So the logic of love is important for humans. The logic of fear, the logic of anger, we can create the logic of any concept, and our students can do this. We can say, what do you think the purpose of fear is? What do you think the purpose of anger is? Using dictionaries, using encyclopedias when they're helpful. We can take now this idea or set of ideas that are contained in or entailed in the elements of reasoning, and we can create instructional strategies, some of which we see here in the Analytic Thinking Guide, some of which are widely used by those using our approach. Here is one template that is very powerful, which can be used over and over again, and it's simply this: having students to figure out the logic of a problem or issue they are reasoning through. In fact, this is one of the ways in which I learned the elements of reasoning myself. I began to internalize the elements, was I took a problem in my own personal life and I said to myself, what exactly is the problem? Articulate the problem. What exactly is the key question? What is my purpose right now in addressing the problem? And this needed to be an important problem, a real problem, one that I had been maybe dealing with for some considerable period of time and hadn't found an answer to. And so it mattered to me. I was motivated to work through this. And in doing this, I would suggest that we take an experimental, or let's say a practice approach to the process, in the way that a basketball coach would engage basketball players in practice. That is, if we're having students analyze a problem, have them analyze the problem and let them make mistakes in doing it. And if so, in basketball practice, we're not going to play the game every time. We're going to engage in different levels of practice, and you're going to be dribbling and dribbling. You're going to be dropping the ball when you dribble sometimes, and sometimes the ball is going to hit your toe and it will roll off, and that's okay because you're in the game and you're dribbling. That's what's important. So we want students to practice analyzing problems, practice, 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 and the more they practice, using any of these processes focusing on the elements of reasoning, the better they will get at reasoning by implication. The more I dribble, the more often I dribble, the better I get at dribbling, even if I don't want to dribble. And so, and nothing essentially, potentially is more important in human life than your reasoning. There's nothing more important to practice than reasoning, because we're reasoning all day long and the quality of our lives depends upon our reasoning and is affected by our reasoning. So we can have students take any question within our discipline and have them figure out the logic of it. Here is an example, very short example and an unsatisfactory example because of the complexities of this kind of problem, but it gets us started in understanding how we could unpack a problem focusing on the elements of reasoning, and students can benefit from these examples. So you could say, for instance, you could have students take the problem and cover up the rest of the page and have them work together and articulate what they think the key question is that would emerge from that problem. And I'm very, I find having students work together is a highly favorable approach because in the teaching and learning process, because they're dealing with complex issues, they're dealing with complex concepts. Why not let them work together and see how well they can work together to address this kind of question? And then of course they'll also do their individual work. This template is perhaps the most widely used template in our approach, which focuses on the elements of reasoning. This can be used in many different ways in the classroom and in professional life and in daily life if we were to take it seriously. If you understand that every article, essay, and chapter in a book and anything like that is a product of someone's reasoning, if you understand that, then you know that every article, essay, or chapter, etc., can be analyzed focusing on these parts, can be deconstructed by entering any of these structures. And so the simple way of saying this is that every author has a purpose in writing an essay, for instance, is asking certain key questions, is using certain kinds of information and specific information, is making certain inferences that can be identified, and so forth. And you see, we've offered this template for students to be able to use in figuring out the logic of an article, essay, chapter, and then we've given them some details to help them unpack what we mean by that. What do we mean by articulating the main purpose of the article? Here, you're trying to state as accurately as possible the author's intent in writing the article. What was the author trying to accomplish? We're just trying to take the thinking apart of the author. We can have students use this template whenever they read an article for our classes. Rather than lecturing to them, we can have them read an article and write out the logic of the article. When they come to class, they give feedback to each other on each part. I share my feedback. I share my work, because whenever I ask students to do the logic of any article, essay, or chapter. I also do my homework because I dare not show up to class with them having done their logic of and me having not done it because I won't be able to give them good feedback, having not prepared myself, because doing the logic of an essay, article, or chapter is complex, and I'm not going to be able to think on my feet very well, and I will be misrepresenting this process to students if I don't show them the complexities in the process, in these processes. So now we can have them do the logic of an article for many of our classes or essay. We can also have them write the logic of any given chapter or every chapter that we assign in our textbook. So we may have them read 10 chapters. We want them to do the logic of every chapter. Write it out before they come. But again, I will have to do this myself to give them feedback um, at hopefully a higher level. And I will be learning from them as well as we each give one another feedback on our papers using intellectual standards. Here is an example of, let's say, an article, a brief article on page 30, and the logic of it, an example of, let's say, a specimen set of answers that students can use to see how close their thinking is to the author's thinking here, who did the logic of it. And so we can have students cover up page 31 using the template on pages 28 and 29, write out the logic of what is the article on page 30, and then share with one another their logics, and then look at our logic that they see on page 31. Do you see how much students will learn in your courses if you're engaging them in these ways just when they're in your classroom? Because they will be on the court, they will be working, and they will be learning these elements of reasoning at deeper levels. On page 32, we find the logic, analyzing the logic of a textbook. We can use the same subtext that we see on pages 28 and 29 if students need it, but they shouldn't need it now. They should be able to figure out the logic of a textbook, which we often find, by the way, in chapter 1, where we have the organizing ideas. Page 33 brings together the elements and the standards. Now we're asking a deeper question. Having figured out the elements of reasoning of an author, is the purpose of the author well stated or clearly implied? Is it justifiable bringing in another intellectual standard, etc.? We also want students to be able to analyze the logic of our subjects. So if I'm teaching science, what is the main purpose of science? What kinds of questions do scientists ask? What sorts of information do they use? What kinds of what types of inferences do they come to? What kind of conclusions do they draw? So we see this focus on the logic of your discipline on the top of page 34. So if I were testing your students at the end of your course, I could ask any one of them, what is the purpose of science? What kinds of questions do scientists ask and pursue? What key kinds of theories do scientists use? What assumptions do they begin with? That will help. When they answer these questions, I will begin to see whether these students of yours, are thinking within the logic of your discipline. So we can do a brief logic of science that you see on page 35. We can do a brief logic of history and sociology and any other field. These brief logics get us in, but then we need to unpack the logics. I like to see the logics in a circle because I want to understand them as the elements as interactive. But when I'm asking students to figure out the logic of a discipline or field of study, I want them to unpack the logic, give me details in the logic. I think that the logic of ecology that we have on pages 40 and 41 exemplifies more of what I'm looking for in student work. And now I would like to point out, moving away from the analytic guide, I'd like to point out that we can take the scientific reasoning guide and several of our other guides and see additional logics that have been developed by us and which you may want to refer to if you have this in your library. I'm looking at page 39 first, and this gives us the logic of science, again in a circle, simplified in a simplified version, and then we can move back to forward rather to pages 42 and forward several pages, and here we get several logics, not only the logic of science expanded, but the logic of other disciplines within science, such as the logic of physics, the logic of chemistry, the logic of geology, the logic of astronomy, the logic of biology, zoology, and you see we can do this within any field of study, the logic of botany, the logic of biochemistry, and so forth. And we can move to another domain, another field of study, and we can see, for instance, in our historical thinking guide, we have the logic of history, and this logic is also expanded, and we have this logic over 4 pages. It's even further expanded, and it's in part because historical thinking is complex. It's part because the entire guide here is focused on historical thinking. So this is another guide that you may want to look at. We also have the Instructor's Guide to Historical Thinking. So I would like to then wrap this up by emphasizing that we've dealt with one conceptual set in our approach to critical thinking. We've focused on the elements of reasoning. There are many possibilities for use of the analytic guide and related guides in the classroom. And you can see how if you understand the logic of, that is, the elements of reasoning embedded in a discipline, then we, by implication, will understand that we need thinker's guides within every field of study that illuminate the fundamental logic of your discipline. So we invite you to share those logics with us, and we will share them with others through our website. In closing, I would like to read to you from the work of John Henry Newman, The Idea of a University. And I'm holding in my hands this book that's so lovely that you can see, maybe, that was published in 1912. The Idea of a University Defined and Illustrated. John Henry Newman says many things that are relevant to our discussion today, but I'm going to only read 2 brief passages in closing. I say then, if we would improve the intellect, first of all, we must ascend. We cannot gain real knowledge on a level. We must generalize. We must reduce to method. We must have a grasp of principles and group and shape our acquisitions by means of them. It matters not whether our field of operation be wide or limited. In every case, to command it is to mount above it. And this idea of mounting above your thinking is essential to critical thinking and to the analysis of thought, because though we are continually reasoning using these elements, we are very often not mounting above, analyzing the thinking that we're doing as we're reasoning. And John Henry Newman is helping us understand this. We must reduce to method. To me, this is where the elements come in to play very powerfully. We're reducing to method how we enter thinking and how we improve thinking. And finally, for today, John Henry Newman says, but the intellect, which has been disciplined to the perfection of its powers, which knows and thinks while it knows, which has learned to leaven the dense mass of facts and events with the elastic force of reason. Such an intellect cannot be partial, cannot be exclusive, cannot be impetuous, cannot be at a loss, cannot but be patient, collected, and majestically calm, because it discerns the end in every beginning, the origin in every end, the law in every interruption, the limit in each delay, because it ever knows where it stands and how its path lies from one point to another. John Henry Newman did not have the advantage of the elements of reasoning in the form that we have them. However, as you see, he is dealing very deeply with these elements of reasoning, as do all deep thinkers. We can take this paragraph and ask our students to analyze this paragraph in connection with the elements of reasoning as an instructional strategy, but we are out of time. So I want to thank you for joining us for this conversation with our fellows, and hope to see you at future programs. Thank you.